In my previous video, I revealed the untold truth about India's military power that's alarming America. Thousands of proud Indians appreciated it and made their voices heard. So today, I've brought another powerful truth. This one is especially for them. The deepest control is not the one that chains your hands, it's the one that chains your mind. For centuries, the West colonized India not just with guns and laws, but with something far more devastating, the manipulation of thought. They convinced generations of Indians that Western models were superior, that Western validation was the ultimate currency, and that Indian culture, philosophy, and intellect were relics of a primitive past. But there came a day when that lie collapsed. There came a moment when India stopped chasing Western approval and began to realize that it was never less. It was simply made to forget its own greatness. The day India broke free was not marked by a war or a treaty or a flag lowered from a building. It was marked by the quiet revolution in the Indian mind. It was the day Indians stopped seeing themselves through the eyes of their former rulers. It was the day they stopped measuring success by foreign standards. It was the day the West's psychological blueprint burned. Because when a nation stops believing in its inferiority, there is no weapon, no policy, no currency that can control it. For decades, the West sustained its grip by positioning its universities, its media, its corporations as the temples of progress. Indians were told they had to leave their country to matter. They were told their languages were backward, their traditions outdated, their philosophies irrelevant. And yet, the ground began to shift. Indians began to return, not just physically, but mentally. They began to rediscover the genius of their own roots. They began to revisit the wisdom buried beneath colonial rubble. Sanskrit texts, once dismissed as mythology, were now being decoded as sophisticated treatises on mathematics, astronomy, and human consciousness. The day the West lost control was the day an Indian student looked at a Western curriculum and said, "This is not the ceiling of knowledge." It was the day Indian entrepreneurs built companies that no longer needed the blessing of foreign investors to succeed. It was the day Indian scientists pursued research not to be accepted by foreign journals, but to solve Indian problems on Indian soil. It was the day Indian authors, filmmakers, and artists stopped watering down their stories to make them palatable for Western audiences. They started speaking in their own voice, to their own people, on their own terms. That voice was not just loud, it was untouchable. The psychological colonization had created a loop. India would seek Western approval. The West would validate, and the cycle would continue. But the day India broke that cycle, the West's power collapsed. The control was never truly in armies, it was in the silent assumption that the West knew better. But India began to see through the illusion. It realized that its ancient wisdom about life, purpose, balance, and human potential had been systematically buried. And when India reclaimed that, the West's grip turned to dust. This psychological emancipation was the moment the West could not reverse. You can outspend a nation, you can outgun a nation, but you cannot control a nation that no longer believes you are its master. That is a permanent loss, and it is precisely what happened. India now stands in a place where it no longer waits for anyone to tell it who it is. It no longer seeks permission to innovate, to lead, or to rebuild itself in its own image. The most shocking part is that the West didn't see it coming. They were busy measuring India's GDP, counting military assets, and tracking elections. But they forgot to watch the most dangerous revolution, the one that happens in the mind. The day India decided that its identity was no longer negotiable was the day the West lost its quiet empire over the Indian psyche. The weapons of the past are now useless. Psychological chains, economic dependencies, cultural filters, they no longer bind. India now writes its own story, in its own language, with its own pen. And that story will not wait for translation. That story will not pause for validation. That story has already left the station, and the West, for the first time, is no longer in the driver's seat. That forever changed everything. There was a time when the West didn't need to invade India to control it. They only needed to control its economy. They needed India to rely on Western money, Western corporations, Western trade routes, and Western approvals. For decades, they held the keys to India's growth. They made India believe that without their investment, India could not rise. But there came a day when that belief died. There came a day when India's economy reached a point of self-sustaining momentum, where Western leverage shattered like glass. That was the day the West lost control over India, economically, permanently, and without warning. The most brutal form of control is economic dependence, because it allows empires to pull strings without firing a single shot. The West mastered this strategy across continents. They weaponized aid. They controlled financial institutions. They dictated the direction of developing nations by offering money tied to invisible chains. But India broke that grip with something the West never expected: scale, resilience, and indigenous enterprise. India began building an economy that no longer stood on the crutches of Western capital. The West believed India's growth would always be bottlenecked by foreign investment. They thought they could walk away and watch India stumble. But India didn't stumble, it sprinted. It built a startup ecosystem that became one of the largest in the world, not because the West approved, but because Indian innovators stopped waiting for approval. Indian businesses stopped asking if they were good enough to compete on the global stage. They started building for India, by India, at a speed the West couldn't process. When Indian digital payment systems like UPI exploded and bypassed the traditional Western-controlled banking networks, it wasn't just a financial evolution, it was a declaration. The West saw 1 billion people leapfrogging credit card dependence in favor of homegrown, lightning-fast platforms. This wasn't the expected path. The West thought India would remain forever tethered to their systems. Instead, India wrote its own financial code and scaled it at a speed no one in Washington, London, or Brussels could control. Trade used to be a weapon against India. Western powers would impose restrictions, set the terms, and apply pressure through financial dependencies. But today, India's trade partnerships are multi-directional. It negotiates from a position of strength with Russia, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe simultaneously. India is no longer the buyer begging for access. It is the marketplace the world competes to enter. That shift was the beginning of the West's loss of economic leverage. India's manufacturing sector, once dismissed as peripheral, became a strategic force. The Make in India movement was not just a slogan, it was a rebellion, it was a calculated assault on the monopoly the West held over global supply chain. It was India telling the world, we will build it here, we will grow it here, we will own it here. The West assumed India would forever remain the service desk of the global economy, dependent on outsourcing deals and foreign jobs. But India flipped the narrative. It didn't just export labor, it began exporting solutions. Even in critical sectors like defense, India's economy broke free. India began developing indigenous weapons, cutting down reliance on Western arms suppliers who once held the leash. That meant India's military choices were no longer dictated by foreign contracts. It meant that Western nations could no longer manipulate India's defense strategies by turning off supply lines. This was a loss the West could neither anticipate nor reverse. What shook the Western power structures even more was India's ability to navigate global economic storms independently. During financial crises that rattled the West, India held steady. When supply chain disruptions crippled Western markets, India adapted. When Western tech giants thought they could dictate terms, India enforced its own digital sovereignty. The message was unmistakable. India will no longer dance to the rhythm of Western economies. It will set its own tempo, and the world will adjust. The West once controlled India's future by controlling its purse. That era is over. India no longer asks what the West will fund, what the West will approve, or what the West will tolerate. It is building an economic engine so vast, so self-feeding, that Western leverage has become irrelevant. The West lost that power the moment India realized its greatest investment was not foreign, it was itself. That is a loss the West cannot recover. That is the day the power balance shifted forever. There was a time when the West confidently believed that the cutting edge of technology would always be its private playground. They imagined India as the distant follower, forever catching up, forever importing, forever asking for permission to access the next level. But there came a moment when that illusion collapsed, and it collapsed with brutal force. India didn't just catch up. It built parallel systems, achieved independent breakthroughs, and sprinted into arenas where the West believed it had an unchallenged monopoly. The day India's technological advancements began to outpace Western expectations was the day the West lost control, and that loss was irreversible. For decades, the Western world assumed that India's role in technology would remain confined to outsourced labor, back-end support, and rented intellectual capacity. They expected India to solve problems for them, but never to solve problems for itself. That underestimation became their blind spot. India didn't wait for technology to be handed down. India built it from scratch, scaled it for 1 billion people, and created models that the West itself now struggles to match. The West was unprepared when India pioneered the world's most advanced, real-time, interoperable digital payment system. UPI didn't just bypass credit cards, it bypassed decades of Western financial dominance. While the West was busy holding on to clunky, expensive systems, India created frictionless payment infrastructure that transformed how 1 billion people transacted daily. They expected India to follow their model, but India wrote its own manual. And the world noticed. Countries are now asking to replicate India's system, not America's. That realization hit harder than a trade war because it wasn't a contest India entered, it was a race India started while the West was still looking at the starting line. Space was supposed to be another Western sanctuary. It was the final frontier where only a few elite players would write the rules. But when India's ISRO successfully launched the Mars orbiter mission on its first attempt at a fraction of the cost of NASA's comparable missions, something snapped in the global perception. The West was not just surprised, they were unprepared for the audacity of it. India did not need a blank check. India did not need to buy foreign expertise. India needed belief, and when it found that, the sky was no longer the limit. The shock wasn't just that India reached Mars, it was that India did it on Indian terms. The West had written India out of that story. They saw India as a customer, not a creator. But when India planted its flag in Martian orbit with precision and economy, the West had to admit, silently, that control had slipped. No longer could they position themselves as the exclusive gatekeepers of space exploration. India forced open the door and walked in. India's technological surge didn't stop at payments and space. It rippled through defense, telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence. India's development of indigenous missile systems like BrahMos stunned military analysts who expected India to remain a perpetual buyer. India's rapid deployment of 5G technology and aggressive digital self-reliance policies shook the core of Western tech giants who thought India would forever depend on their platforms. Perhaps the most unsettling realization for the West is that India's breakthroughs aren't isolated. They are compounding. India isn't moving in a straight line. It's moving exponentially. Each innovation fuels the next. Each success births a network of self-sufficiency. It's not just that India is becoming good at one thing, it's that India is becoming capable of building everything it needs faster than the West predicted and cheaper than the West can compete with. What makes this even more profound is that India's technological ambition is no longer aimed at gaining the West's attention. India is building for India. India is innovating for its villages, its cities, its farmers, its students. It is creating solutions that work at scale for its own people, not to chase Western markets, but to transform its own landscape. This shift renders Western approval irrelevant. India has outgrown the need for Western applause. For centuries, the West believed that controlling India's culture was the softest, most effective form of domination. When you make a nation ashamed of its own identity, you can rule it without armies. The West's greatest power was not just its weapons. It was its ability to convince India that Western standards of beauty, success, education, language, and lifestyle were the ultimate goals. They didn't need to force India to conform. They slowly taught India to willingly abandon itself. But there came a moment when that spell broke. There came a moment when India turned inward, rediscovered the power of its ancient soul, and rejected the need for Western approval. That was the day the West's cultural grip shattered permanently. The West worked relentlessly to embed its cultural hierarchy inside Indian hearts. English became the gatekeeper of intelligence. Western degrees became the proof of success. Imported ideologies became the new religion. Indian traditions were dismissed as regressive. Indian spirituality was reduced to exotic stories. And slowly, generation after generation, Indians were made to feel that progress meant walking away from their own reflection. That silent, psychological colonization was more dangerous than any battlefield defeat. But the revolution didn't explode. It unfolded quietly, like the steady rising of the sun. India began to remember. It began to remember the depth of its literature, the brilliance of its philosophies, the timeless relevance of its spirituality, and the unmatched complexity of its languages. It began to see through the false trade-off it was sold, the lie that it could either be modern or be Indian, but not both. And the moment India realized it could be fully modern and unapologetically Indian at the same time, the West's strongest weapon crumbled. What the West failed to understand is that India's cultural depth is not a relic, it is a living system, breathing and adapting across millennia. When Indian music, cinema, fashion, and art stopped chasing Western templates and started embracing local authenticity, something profound happened. The West stopped being the center. Indians no longer needed Western validation to know their stories mattered. They no longer needed to dilute their accents, their clothing, and their customs to fit into foreign rooms. The most powerful moment was not when India became fluent in English. It was when India chose to speak back in its own languages on global platforms without apology. The explosion of India's domestic film industry, unapologetically telling Indian stories for Indian audiences, is not just entertainment, it is cultural warfare against decades of imported narratives. Bollywood did not collapse under the weight of Hollywood. It expanded on its own terms, on its own soil. The rise of regional cinema in Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Kannada, and more, pushing beyond the artificial walls of so-called global standards, is a rejection of the old hierarchy. When Indian stories stopped asking to be translated and started demanding to be understood, the cultural tide turned. Indian fashion reclaimed its symbols. Once mocked, traditional clothing is now a statement of elegance and power. Indian festivals, long dismissed as chaotic or primitive by colonial commentators, are now celebrated globally without Western mediation. Yoga, Ayurveda, and Indian dietary systems, which were once reduced to fringe curiosities, are now sought after in the same Western capitals that once dismissed them. But now, India isn't asking for that recognition, it simply embodies it. Perhaps the most shocking shift for the West was the intellectual resurgence of Indian philosophy. The West sold the world a materialist lens, and India quietly reintroduced a consciousness-centered worldview. It reasserted that human flourishing is not limited to external success, but is deeply tied to inner mastery. Western academic institutions, which once ridiculed Indian philosophical frameworks, now study them with seriousness they never offered before. The West lost control the day India stopped looking in the mirror of foreign opinion and started seeing itself with its own eyes. It lost control when India's youth, once desperate to leave, began to stay, not because they couldn't leave, but because they didn't have to prove anything outside their own borders. The hunger for Western approval dissolved because India remembered that it had already built civilizations, philosophies, cities, medicines, and languages that the world still cannot fully comprehend. The most profound realization is this: the West didn't just lose military or economic power over India, it lost the ability to define what it means to be Indian. India is no longer trapped in the reflection cast by colonial shadows. It is now the light source, it is now the storyteller, it is now the center. And that cultural independence is irreversible. That freedom the West can never reclaim. That day, the day India reclaimed its identity, is the day the West's hold was lost forever. For centuries, India's rise was measured by one unspoken question: what does the West think? Every step, every treaty, every advancement was viewed through the lens of whether it was accepted, acknowledged, or endorsed by Western powers. The world's maps were drawn with Western pens. The rules were written in Western languages. India was told that to matter globally, it must pass through Western approval gates. But then came a day when India stopped knocking on those gates. India's rise as a global power was not a sudden eruption. It was a deliberate evolution. The West had expected India to follow the template, align with Western power blocs, adopt Western strategies, and play a subordinate role in global decisions. And it's about the way in which India determined its own path to global power. It was not a subordinate role in global decision, but India refused the script. It chose independence, not just political independence, but intellectual, strategic, and moral independence. The West thought India would remain a dependent variable in their global equations, but India became its own axis. The most shocking realization for the West came when India chartered a foreign policy that didn't beg for Western alignment. India maintained strategic partnerships with America, cultivated strong ties with Russia, expanded deep relationships with the Middle East, and forged independent agreements with China, all while strengthening its position within the global South. It didn't pick sides based on Western pressure. It picked sides based on Indian interests. India was no longer a piece on someone else's chessboard. India was now playing its own game on its own board, and the West realized it couldn't dictate the moves. India's defiance of Western narratives became even clearer in moments of global crisis. When the world splintered into geopolitical camps, India refused to be trapped. It purchased energy from where it served its people, it negotiated trade deals that served its industries, and it voted in international bodies with its own calculus, not to please, but to protect. But perhaps the most profound blow to Western control came when India realized it didn't need to ask permission to lead. It stepped into global leadership roles not as a junior partner, but as an equal architect. India led the International Solar Alliance to combat climate change without waiting for Western instructions. India hosted global summits where emerging economies gathered not to imitate the West, but to build new partnerships independent of it. India's voice began shaping global standards, not just following them. The West, which once set the narrative on India's human rights, economy, and democracy, found that India now responds, not with apologies, but with counter-narratives. When criticized, India no longer bows, it questions the very framework of the critique. India's global power is not just visible in summits and speeches. It is encoded in the quiet confidence of a nation that knows it can no longer be sidelined. Its population size is not a burden, it is a market that drives global business decisions. Its military is not just growing, it is independently decisive. Its economy is not simply participating, it is reshaping trade routes and investment patterns. Its culture is not seeking entry, it is pulling global attention without trying. The West once believed that to lead globally, a nation had to move through their systems, their endorsements, their structures. But India built parallel pathways. It built technological ecosystems, financial networks, and diplomatic frameworks that bypassed traditional Western strongholds. India is not waiting to be let in, it has already arrived. The world now adjusts to India's presence, not the other way around. The most powerful transformation is that India no longer seeks validation. It does not operate to be noticed. It operates to fulfill its own vision. This shift is what permanently broke Western control. Power is no longer granted by the West. It is claimed by those who decide they no longer need permission. India decided. That was the day the chains that lingered in the background finally dissolved. That was the day India rose, not as a former colony reclaiming stolen ground, but as a sovereign force writing its own chapter on its own terms. And from that day forward, the West could only watch. The permission India once waited for had expired forever.